Well, I like numbers, which is a strange thing for a theater artist to say. But uh, just as a recreational hobby, I like reading data-based journalism. And, there's been some of that in the theater field, but not nearly as much as I'd like to see. I mean, obviously, TCG puts together its guide of the 10 most produced plays each year, and those things are important, but it doesn't feel like there are that many people taking a deep dive into the topic. So I was at in terms of the initial seed for this piece, I was at the LMDA conference in the summer of 2019, Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of America. And there was a dramaturg who was on a panel who was speaking, and he said, we all have plays that we don't do, plays with children, plays with large casts, etc. And that comment actually got me thinking, first, not so much about who's writing for the stage, but what the content of the plays look like, and if there really was a truth behind that kind of cliche of, oh, we do this kind of play, but we don't do that kind of play. And so it actually started with me being interested in things like cast size, and are the assumptions we're making about cast size, especially cast size of new plays, backed up by the data. And so that's kind of where I started. And there's another writer on HowlRound, Portia McGovern, who's been doing a lot of database writing for them for quite a few years, looking at who's directing and designing in LORT companies. And so in looking at her work, I started to think, well, what might this look like if I expanded that out to the area of new play development? And is there a way to really start to map out through data who's writing for our stage, and what kinds of things are they writing? How many characters are on the stage? What do those characters look like? And can we, through numbers, get a picture of our stage, as opposed to just waxing about what we think we're seeing? Yeah, that was essentially my goal, was to see if I could get substantial survey participation from LORT artistic directors and literary managers, as well as NNPN NNPN artistic directors and literary managers, to start trying to measure what the landscape of new play production currently looks like across the country. So that was the impetus for the project.
Okay. Did you do this all by yourself?
I did. Obviously, anytime anyone who works with HowlRound has an editor, and I had a wonderful editor who looked at all my writing and gave feedback and helped with the revising process. But in terms of the data collection, the data analysis, and the write-up of the article, this was work that I did by myself.
How long was it since you started looking for the first bits of information till the final draft to your editor? How long did this take?
3-4 months.
Okay. That's a lot of work for 3-4 months.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So you put out questionnaires, I believe, to, I think, 111 theaters in LORT at National New Play Network theaters?
111 productions at no, actually, sorry, I'm sorry. You are correct. No, I am correct. Sorry.
One of us is correct.
111 titles.
Okay.
Slightly fewer companies than that,
Gotcha.
But 111 titles.
So how many responded?
I had a response rate of 72%. So I received completed surveys for 80 of the 111 titles that I identified.
Okay. What questions did you ask?
So there were 3 kind of broad categories of questions. The first was kind of drilling down into the identity of the playwrights themselves. The second was kind of drilling down into the identity of the characters and cast size. And then the third category was looking at things like genre and runtime. So in terms of questions about the playwright, or questions about gender identity, cisgender and transgender, ethnic background, does the playwright have an MFA, as well as age. And then from there, I started to look at cast. So how large is the cast, as well as cast composition? Are at least half of the characters specified by female by the playwright? Are at least half of the characters specified as non-white by the playwright? And then asking if the play contains characters from specific demographic groups. So does the play have any African American characters in it? Does the play have any Asian or Asian American characters in it? Latinx characters, Middle Eastern or Arab American characters? And then finally, I started to look at the content of the play. So I asked things like, does the play have an intermission? Would you consider this play to be realism? Does this play mostly take place in someone's home? And what would you say is kind of the central thematic focus of the play? So it wasn't just looking at the who of the playwright and the who of the characters, but also trying to look at, does our theater really look like 90-minute plays that are all kind of family, domestic, realistic dramas? And how true is that actually in practice?
Yeah. Let's go back to the beginning of that, because let's talk about gender, first of all. I noticed in the article you have Playwrights by Gender Part 1 and Playwrights by Gender Part 2. And in the first part, you give a breakdown of percentages, but in the second part, you say 100% are cisgender, 0% are transgender. I find that surprising. I would think that there would be not so much of a complete lack of transgender playwrights. Surely somebody must have been produced someplace in one of these theaters. I found that to be, at least in this day and age, because we are starting to get more progressive. We are starting to get more inclusive, despite what the fears of the subscriber base might be. So that part, at least, I found very surprising.
I was certainly disappointed. I don't know if I would say that I was surprised. Just having looked at seasons over the past few years as well. But it certainly was a data point that really stood out to me, that out of the 80 completed surveys, 100% of the playwrights were identified as cisgender. Yeah. There were a few respondents who left that question blank because they didn't know the answer. It's quite possible that there are transgender playwrights who are not out, or whose gender identity was not known to the respondent. Right. But at least in all instances where someone responded to the question, there was 0% of the writers identified as transgender.
Again, like you said, disappointing. But what I found previously when looking at your details here, 53.3% are women, 42.7% are men. Is that a sign of progress? Is that less than what it was the year before? Because I know that the issue of producing women playwrights has been a big one, at least in the major theaters, for a very long time.
Well, this is the first year I've conducted the study. It is my intention to do this over a longer period of time. So this data can be seen longitudinally, and we can see how these numbers fluctuate over time. But to my knowledge, this is the first time that anyone's done a study of an entire season like this. Right. So I can't say if it's an improvement over the previous year. I think certainly the fact that the majority of these writers are female is an encouraging sign. My hunch is that those numbers will go up even more. And I say this because when you actually kind of drill down by age, when you get to younger writers, it's even a slightly higher percentage who are female. So I think much as the larger workforce is changing and transforming and becoming in this country and becoming a majority female workforce, I think we will really start to see that with playwrights and gender identity over the next decade. And I would not be surprised, if I did this study in 2030, if it came out 60-40 even. I really wouldn't be.
Good, because I know, like you said, we were looking. TCG does the 10 most produced plays of every year, and inevitably a number of those are Shakespeare, of course, possibly because of the rights. But the women that keep popping up are Teresa Rebick and Lauren Gunderson, year after year after year, and they are extremely popular playwrights, and their plays get done a lot. I was wondering if personally, I'd love to see more variation on that. It's just to see more voices from the women's world shining through in our larger theaters.
Yeah, I think you'll see. I think you'll see a greater diversification on that TCG list as well over the next decade. I mean, you can already kind of start to see it. Lauren Yee, I know, was on it this past year. She's being produced quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Lynn Nottage is a writer who's been on and off that list as well.
Right.
So I do think you'll see that trend expand as well beyond just kind of white women dominating the TCG list. And I think, the next data point here where I look at racial identity of the playwrights in terms of new play production, while white writers are the largest group represented, collectively non-white writers are forming a majority of playwrights who received world premieres at LORT and NNPN companies this season. So I think it's only a matter of time until that starts to trickle down and manifest in second productions and third productions and 10th productions and 12th productions, which means that the kind of list that TCG does will also start to diversify as well.
Sure. Can you posit an explanation for why this is a trend, why this is happening? Why we're getting more non-white writers being produced?
I think this generation of literary managers and dramaturgs are just more conscious about race and diversity and how that lives in season programming and season planning. And I remember 6-7 years ago, both the Guthrie Theater and the Alley Theater had an entire season where every playwright was white and male, and every director was white and male. I don't just mean new play; I mean the entire season.
Sure.
And I think rightly so, we're just kind of publicly dragged through cyberspace and really held to account for not diversifying what they're putting on the stage and who they're putting in directors' chairs. And I think younger dramaturgs are really committed to making sure that doesn't happen with their new play programming.
I'm assuming discussions about this are showing up in conferences like the LMDA that you attended a while back.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's on the forefront of everyone's mind. I think, especially in this historical moment as we're dealing with the Trump administration. Um, I think people are thinking even more intentionally about questions of racial equity and representation, given
Yeah.
given what the leadership of our country looks like.
Or the lack thereof, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, which we will get back to in a different question. I just want to touch upon one or two more of these
Sure.
really interesting statistical figures. Some of this was heartening to me and encouraging. 65.8% of these plays, at least half of the characters are female. And in 57.7%, at least half of the characters are non-white. So that to me shows some kind of attention being given by people in the industry to increased attention to voices that have not been heard as much as they should have over the years. Was that a surprise to
Definitely.
you, or did you expect that?
It's a little higher than I expected. It's not that much higher than I'd expect after you look at the numbers for who's writing for the theater. So if you think about it in those ways, in that way, you have 53% of these playwrights are female. So it wouldn't be surprising if the vast majority of those plays feature at least 50% of female roles. Similarly, about 53% of these plays were written by non-white writers. So again, it wouldn't be surprising if those writers are choosing to write about the communities that they come from. So I would say it's a little higher than I'd expect, but is still kind of very much in line with what you think would happen if you're diversifying who's writing for the stage. Because once you diversify your playwright pool, then you start to diversify your character pool. You start to diversify the stories that you're telling, which then in turn trickles down to diversifying your acting pool. So these things kind of create this chain reaction, but it
Right.
really does start at the diversifying your playwriting pool level.
I would not argue with that, but I would throw in, how do we diversify our audiences? I mean, if you look at most theaters, you're going to see not a whole heck of a lot of difference, more so than there have been in years past. But still, theater is, when you look at the audiences, it's not as diverse as one might wish.
I would be curious, and it's not something that I measured, and I'm not sure if it's something that could be measured, but I would be curious to see if the audience for the more diverse plays in this study was also more diverse. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I do think, in general, when you program stories about people's communities, they're more likely to attend
Yeah.
because they feel like they will see themselves on stage. And I think, in answer to your question, if you diversify your programming and you take down financial barriers to attendance and you combine those two things together,
Sure.
then you'll really start to see a change in what audiences look like and an audience composition. So the programmatic aspect of it, I think, is half of the puzzle.
Probably. I agree with you, at least about the financial barriers. Theater is expensive. It's expensive to produce. It's extremely expensive to maintain. Most of an artistic director's job is begging for money. Trying to keep the theaters open in non-COVID-19 times is enough of a struggle. and seats need to be filled, which is the number one job of management of any particular theater. But making it accessible, taking away, because I still think theater has a kind of a stigma. You have to get up, you have to get dressed, you have to make an evening of it instead of sitting in your recliner eating popcorn and watching, America's Got Talent, which is very easy to do. This requires effort, and this means you are out with other people. So it's a whole different kind of thing. You have to make this effort to do it. And leaving Broadway aside, because the prices there have been just absolutely ridiculous. Still, community theaters or regional theaters are charging sometimes $50 a ticket. How do I know I'm going to get my $50 worth? That's the thing, which is, I think, a big barrier to most people taking that chance, taking that shot, and putting on a pair of pants and actually going out.
I agree. Yeah, I agree completely. And I hope someone will really do the statistical research into that topic as well. I mean, again, part of why I did what I did was I wanted to just inspire more data-based journalism in the theater today. And I would hope that in seeing an article like this, people would be inspired to collect data on other things as well. And one of those things that, in fact, was on my mind was audience composition. And this study is designed solely to look at what do our new plays look like. But I would hope that someone would pick up the mantle and study what do our audiences look like and how much do they change based on what's on the stage, based on price point, and those kinds of questions. Obviously, it would be a very, very heavy lift, but I think we need to know that. Yeah. My hunch is that most theaters probably have some sense of that within their own individual data, but kind of pooled nationwide, there really isn't any measurement, at least that I know of, that kind of tries to measure who's coming to the theater. I mean, the NEA does some pretty big studies around income level and theater attendance. So that's probably the best gauge of it. But I really do think we need to drill much more deeply into this topic with numbers, because right now it really does like we're flying blind.
Well, I think we're coming to a new awakening, and we're starting to put the tools that we have into service to diagnose the situation that we happen to be in. So I think, in a sense, we are flying blind because we have individuals like yourself taking this on. And this is a big job. If you're going to do this again year after year, you're probably going to need some help because this is not an easy thing to do. So it'll be interesting to see how theater's self-analysis progresses in the next couple of years. I'd like to go back to something we touched on earlier, which relates to another article that you wrote called Making Theater in the Season of Trump. And again, talking about audience composition, which I wanted to touch on earlier. You raised the proposition in this article, which you wrote in 2016. Okay, so that was 4 years ago. And I want to ask you what your views are now on that article and how they are still the same and how they may have changed. But you raised the proposition that most theater audiences do not have a significant population of Trump supporters. And then you follow this with, and I quote, "I do wonder if the Trump phenomenon would have come into being if politicians, artists, and activists had made an effort to engage members of these communities sooner. Theaters must now ask themselves, what would that engagement look like? What barriers of entry, financial being one of them, would need to be dismantled to reach these communities, and what plays would make these individuals feel empowered instead of angry and resentful? Go.
Well, in terms of what's not changed, I think that question is just as vital as it was in April of 2016 when I wrote the article.
Yeah.
I also have no idea how to answer that question 4 years later, just as I had no idea how to answer it when I posed it either.
This is a tricky question. Do we present material that will lure them into the theater? What would that material be? Would it be something that the theater might not particularly agree with? I know in the music world it's different because we have songs that are played over and over and over again, which have content that are not the most open, not, some of it's a bit racist, but they're extremely popular and they get played over and over. And to do something to reach out to this particular group of folks, what kind of material would need to be programmed? That to me is a puzzling conundrum.
I think plays like Lynn Nottage's Sweat probably fall into that category of the kind of programming that would work. Obviously, that play is filled with characters whose political and social viewpoints are quite different from her own, and yet it feels like she is writing from a compassionate place, even as characters engage in choices that I assume she would stridently disagree with. I think that play kind of gets at some of the underlying class resentment and racial resentment that gave rise to the Trump phenomenon without judging or berating those who are participants in that. So those might be the kinds of plays that I would look to that explore the dissolving social fabric that we have right now. I wish I had a better answer. I wish we all
had better answers. I'm not sure we can answer that right now.
Yeah, I think the only times our audiences are truly diverse are when we're presenting popular entertainment, not substantive entertainment. So a touring production of The Lion King can attract people from all walks of life. Wicked, those kinds of shows, but they don't really change the way we think about things or foster a more cohesive community. Right. So I don't know how you do something that's substantive, art-based, inclusive, socially relevant, in line with your values, and still find a way to attract a politically diverse audience in this time of intense polarization. Everything is polarized.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And theater is not immune to that political polarization. And I don't know how it would get itself out of that larger trend. But nevertheless, I think it's incredibly important that we muddle through and find some way to do it.
I do too. And it will take some time. Nothing is ever solved in a day. And this may will probably almost inevitably take years. It's a question, I think, of introducing and changing things a little bit at a time bringing more and more people in, so there is no, quote, fear of theater or, quote, fear of being singled out as an audience member by a play that will make you feel like you're being attacked, and yet finding ways to get the person in seat 32B to talk to the person in seat 31A in a way that is constructive and enlightening, because a lot of the plays that are coming out now are raising, well, they have been forever, are raising questions that need to be discussed. The best plays make you think long after the play is over. You also raise
and I will say one last thing. Obviously, I wrote this before Trump was elected, and as I said at the start of that article, I wrote it believing that he would ultimately be defeated at the ballot box in November 2016. I was wrong, and I think his electoral victory has made this even more difficult because he's a narcissist, so all conversations come back to him. Yeah. It's very difficult to have any sort of political or social conversation that doesn't circle around his orbit. And I do think once he is out of office, it will be easier again to start to create those spaces, because we can start to think in terms of our social fabric as opposed to tribes in relationship to this particular individual, which draws really, really rigid fault lines and doesn't create much of a Venn diagram for overlap.
No, it doesn't. Not a whole lot. Yeah, no, it's not going to be an easy project. And we have to realize that it's going to take time, but we have to do it anyway, I believe. So, okay, let's move to something not quite as contentious. MFAs. I have one. You have one. On the one hand, my MFA it's nice to have letters after my name, and I feel like I've absolutely accomplished something. And I have gotten some very decent training in theater, in playwriting. It has helped me grow. Is it any more useful than that?
I mean, for me, obviously, it was incredibly useful, but that was in large part because I felt like I wanted to go into higher education, and the MFA was a foot in the door when it comes to teaching. But I do think more broadly that yes, it, at least when it comes to playwriting, again, I don't have data on terms of an MFA in acting, but at least to me, when it comes to playwriting, it does seem like the MFA is very, very important for getting work. So to go back to the previous article, 54.4% of these writers have an MFA, which at first glance you think, oh, that's it's about half and half. That's not a huge piece of the pie, but you think about how many people are actually writing plays versus how many people are writing plays who have an MFA. People who are writing plays who have an MFA are a much, much smaller portion of the pie than 54.4%. There are so many people out there writing plays. And so at least when it comes to the new play production landscape, I mean, we very much have a pipeline of your MFA gets you a literary agent. Your literary agent gets your script on a literary manager's desk with a company that does not accept unsolicited scripts or scripts by anyone other than represented writers. Right. So from that standpoint, to me, the data is pretty clear that the MFA does a lot for aspiring writers. I don't have data on opportunities for directors or actors or designers So I can't really speak to that.
Sure.
My MFA is in dramaturgy. Anecdotally, I can speak to that. It seems like it certainly does open some doors, but isn't necessarily the deciding factor in terms of who gets hired as a dramaturg or a literary manager at companies. I think most companies have dramaturgs and literary managers who don't have MFAs.
Right.
And some of that's also just because you only have, I think, 4, maybe 5 universities in the U.S. right now that are granting MFAs in dramaturgy. So it's a pretty small pool.
Oh, yeah, it's a very small pool. I mean, finding a theater program in dramaturgy is a search in itself.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about your real work, on the ground, boots on the ground kind of thing. You're in Winston-Salem, but is that correct, Winston-Salem?
I live in the Raleigh-Durham area.
Okay, good enough.
Yeah.
You've actually worked on getting a $1.2 million grant program for artists in the area. And that takes an awful lot of work, going to meetings, going to city councils, putting together paperwork, drawing up budgets. You're obviously not a very lazy person. So let's talk about that project and what came of it. And the only thing I'm going to say right now is that you asked for $1.2 million, which is not a whole lot of money. It sounds like a whole lot of money when you first talk about it, but when you consider how much support they give to other things like, sports and such like that, it's really a drop in the bucket. What was that journey like for you?
Sure. So this started as a form of political and social activism back in August of 2019. A friend of mine who's a playwright and a novelist began organizing a speakers series. So twice a month, our city council has public work sessions on Thursday afternoons, and 3 artists from the community would speak at each of those sessions, urging our council to put public dollars behind the arts. We didn't really, when we started out, we didn't really know exactly where we were headed. After about 2 months of the speaker series, and I spoke at the first session, and they'd heard from 12 or 15 artists at that point. A member of council said to my friend, "Look, put something together, give us something to look at." So she and I and another friend of mine who's a co-founder of Bulldog Ensemble Theater, which is the theater company that I'm a member of, we started writing a draft of a proposal of what we wanted our city's investment in the arts to look like. We scoured a lot of municipal grant programs all across the country and pulled from various models. We looked pretty closely at Raleigh's model. Since we live in Durham, it was the city next door, and Raleigh invests $5 per capita and doles out about $1.8 million annually in arts grants. So we tried to put something together of comparable scale based on the population in Durham.
Sure.
And so we began work on that proposal. The city has a cultural advisory board, and so the mayor referred the proposal to the advisory board. We then worked with the advisory board throughout November, December, and January, doing some revisions. Those revisions ultimately led to a unanimous endorsement by the advisory board. And then our city government really starts its budget process in February and March and wraps it up in April. It felt like we were going into that with a fair amount of momentum. I think we were all kind of assuming that we would get something, although we didn't think we would get the full ask of $1.2 million. And a couple of things kind of started to create bumps in the road. There was a major public housing issue in our city in January, where our city's largest public housing complex became riddled with carbon monoxide, and those repairs became a giant, new, and unexpected expenditure in our city's budget. So that kind of started to change the landscape for us. The city had a vote, I want to say March 6th, about whether or not to advance the proposal for further consideration. It was voted for advancement, but at a reduced amount. So we put in a revised proposal where we've asked for $400,000, and we've listed our top 3 priorities. I had felt pretty good that we would at least get something from that. In the post-COVID-19 landscape, I'm skeptical that any new funding will get approved this year. I think, small businesses are getting absolutely hammered.
Everybody's closing. Yeah.
Our city's revenue is going to take a huge hit. It collects so much money in hospitality tax. Our big performing arts center, our hotels, those are closed. I mean, they're not generating any revenue. So it's a bit strange to have done all of this work, to have taken individual meetings with every members of council, who've spoken over and over again, to have worked with the city's advisory board, to have worked with the mayor, and then obviously circumstances that are so much bigger than our little push for funding the arts in our small corner of the world have come together. That I think something will happen eventually. There's definitely been a great deal of movement in terms of how the city thinks about the arts. And for anyone who's listening, I really would encourage you to reach out to your city council members, reach out to your mayor, reach out to your county commissioners if it's your county that's invested in the arts, because activism around this issue can really start to change people's thinking. It was very clear. We have a very progressive council, but it just kind of wasn't on their radar until a bunch of people organized to put it on their radar.
Yeah.
And so even if nothing happens this year, I'm confident that there will be some degree of change that comes to the arts in my city within the next 2 or 3 years at the latest, because the ball really moved forward quite a lot.
Yeah, and this whole coronavirus thing has changed everything.
Everything
in our society. We are now all quarantined, and it's hard to do any kind of entertainment thing, any kind of project anymore, because nobody's getting together, and nobody's getting together in groups. But I'm not sure that means the end of arts projects. You're a member of the Bulldog Durham Ensemble.
I am.
Are you guys talking about how to circumvent the coronavirus, how to stay together, how to keep projects moving? I mean, we've got a whole cyber world to explore, and in that, it's still a relatively safe way to communicate to others. Has there been talk of that?
Honestly, I think all of us are so concerned with handling the chaos of our familial lives and handling the chaos in our full-time jobs that pay our salaries that we haven't really had the time and energy to look intensely at what we want our company to be like in this moment. Our next show isn't scheduled until the latter part of May. We have not officially canceled that. Obviously, we have to make a decision soon because that show will probably need to go into rehearsal, and that show will probably go into rehearsal in about a month. I would be very, very surprised if that show gets off the ground. And then we'll just have to decide how we're going to go from there. But at least from my perspective, there are so many unknowns in terms of the duration of this that long-term strategic planning. For us as I don't want to call us a volunteer arts organization, because we do compensate all of our artists to the best that we can. Everyone is paid for their work, but it's not anybody's primary source of income. And so, I think we're all just kind of trying to figure out how to keep so many of the areas in our lives from capsizing under this weight. And we'll see where we are in the summer and assess from there what our company looks like in 2020, 2021, what that season looks like. As a company, we've always done our season planning quite late. We typically do our season planning during the summer. So in some ways, it's not that different than how we normally operate, since we tend to do the work on the late side.
Yeah. It's a journey that all of us are, excuse me, a journey that all of us are learning to navigate as we go, because there is no playbook for this.
Yeah, there isn't.
And as you say, family, life, work, and theater comes a little bit further down the road. But I will say that it is still an important part of our lives, an important part of keeping in touch and keeping together with our fellows, because ensemble projects, if we start to lose touch with each other and we stop being creative, then I think that's going to be the worst tragedy of all. I am so glad you came by to talk with us today. It's been a really, really good conversation, and it's been interesting. Lots of stuff to think about, between the statistics and the propositions and suppositions about the way theater is and will evolve, especially in this time of plague. It's going to be a couple of interesting years to see which way our profession goes. But thank you so much for coming by to talk about it.
My pleasure, George. I really appreciate it.
Hey kids, thanks for listening to Onstage Offstage. Onstage Offstage is produced monthly and can be heard on WRFI Ithaca Community Radio, 88.1 and 91.9 Watkins Glen. All of our shows are archived and can be found at onstageoffstage.org and also on iTunes. If you enjoy what we do, please recommend us to your friends. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at OnOffStage. Onstage Offstage believes in and advocates for a world where all people are free to live their lives as they wish, in peace and without fear. We believe in universal respect, diversity, and equality in all areas of life for all people, no matter their nationality, race, religion, age, sexual orientation, or gender. I'm George Sapio. Thanks once again for listening.